So, Michael, last time I counted, there were literally 141 different distributions and installers and hosted versions of Kubernetes out there. Why do we need that many?
Well, I guess we probably don't need that many. I mean, it's that seems like an awful lot. I mean, if you there's I hesitate to say how many distributions we would need, but I think clearly that's way too many. like like I think generally who like I guess if you look at the public clouds, they'll each have like their own sort of version. And then there's probably, I don't know, 10 to 20 like other people who would sell what you could call a distribution, like including us at VMware, or a way of running it. And then you've got like various scenarios, like the I don't know what you would call it, the form factor you run it in, whether it's a
Yeah.
car, a cloud, a desktop. But yeah, 141 is a little excessive. It's probably just a lot of innovation going on.
That must be it. That must be it. Yeah, and I think initially the idea, I think back in 2014, when we think back to that time, the idea was, or at least how I always understood it, was that you have a couple of clusters and they are just multi-tenancy, and you run your
Mm.
application based on policies and you separate them appropriately, and then really all you need is one cluster for an enterprise. I remember conversations where we even talk about stretching clusters across clouds, and clearly that's not really happening today. Right?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I mean, I think back, like, was it 5 or so years ago? Like a lot of the conversation around Kubernetes was fanciful. like I there's this a podcast that I do, and I'm kind of famous for, this doesn't happen much anymore, but every time we talked about some new Kubernetes thing, I would say, "Oh, I thought it did that already." And I think that's kind of what we've learned, and it kind of gets to the distribution thing, is that I also kind of don't really know what a Kubernetes distribution is in the classical sense of, right. Like I understand what a Linux distro is. Like, it's a selection of the source and the way it's put together, and then you compile it, and there's some binaries. I mean,
Right.
more or less, right? But
Right.
with Kubernetes, it's kind of like, it's almost like a distribution is a combination of how you install it, like literally how you
Right.
move the bits around, and how you configure it, which is like different than what I think of a distro as, which kind of confuses it even more.
Because you can't do too much different, right? You need to leave the cluster API as it is.
Right.
You have to make sure, it stays the way it's interoperable for workloads. Otherwise, with the benefit of Kubernetes.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that was I feel like the two motivations for doing Kubernetes, like from the documentary, were one, to compete with AWS, as I recall. But then
Right.
two, the way to go about doing it was like, what if we standardize this layer, right? And so that, exactly to your point, like, well, if you're going to standardize the way a layer works, like the first rule of, like, as the Kubernetes people call their stuff, like an API management, is like, you can't customize it. like once you customize an API, you're no longer part of that ecosystem, right? You're just some weird little proprietary thing on their own. So it does drive that, like, the distinction of a distro that's incompatible with other distros. I think that layer moves more up to how you're using it versus like the thing itself.
Yeah, and it goes really much in line with things where we see Kubernetes something that's specifically usable, or a distribution that's specifically targeted toward edge use cases, where
Mm,
it's just a subset of the complete Kubernetes in a lightweight fashion,
sure.
right? And uh, similar for a couple of other use cases where it's tied to a workload. Certain cloud providers or enterprise software providers, they have their own distribution, and I believe, there are things like, oh, we're only supporting it if it's running on our Kubernetes distribution, or there's
Mm,
implications, at least, if you don't run it on ours because it was tested for it, even though that's against the spirit of Kubernetes, right?
yeah. Yeah. And you're reminding me, like as you're saying, right? Like, there is there's being a subset or stripping down something, so, like whatever it may be, but in this, with Kubernetes, so it runs on the limited resources of edge. But it reminds me of another thing of like people in the multi-cloud world. There's a lot of discussion of like portability and lock-in and things like that, and to some extent, like, I mean, those are valid concerns, but it also gets to the point of like, well, presumably there's things you've customized about how you use it, like your own middleware and your own services and the data that you have. So it's not to be dismissive of those concerns, but like more than likely what I think it does point towards that openness that you're talking about you want with Kubernetes is like, let's like not do that at this layer. Right? Like let's cause problems for ourselves higher up the stack where it really matters, but not down at this layer that should be pretty standard and fungible.
Yeah. And the interesting thing is, of course, when you look at AWS and Azure and GCP, all of those Kubernetes distributions are obviously there so that you use and consume more of these public cloud resources, right? It should make that easy
Sure.
to spin up a lot of stuff and to consume a lot of stuff very quickly and very easily. And I think because I see a hint of the Tanzu logo on your hoodie there, I have to ask you, what is Tanzu's stance? What is Tanzu's idea when you talk about having multiple distributions on multiple clouds? What's the value there?
Well, I think, I think it's, to use a phrase way back when I used to use a lot, it's just heterogeneous systems management, which is to say you need the management tools, the configuration. I won't go into the full, ITIL litany of areas, which are still nice, right? Like you still do basically the same things. But yeah, I think if you're in a larger organization, you end up with a bunch of different things, right? Like it's very rare that you have one thing. Like all you have to do is acquire one company, and now you've got heterogeneous IT, right? Like, which happens frequently. And so a lot of what we're doing is making sure that the management tools that you use can work with whatever you may have. And then also it's trying to enforce, no matter what service that you're using or distro, as we were talking about, it's trying to set up a standard way for your application developers to use that Kubernetes layer, to use that layer underneath, right? And, the great thing about something like Kubernetes is there is a lot of variety. There's those 141 distros and all of the other tools around it, which means, true to its nature, like it really is a good toolkit, a good platform for building platforms, as they say. So it's possible to go in and say like, well, here's a platform that layers on top of all of these things and uses that standardized core to really give you like a platform as a service that will run wherever you might be. Because again, most large organizations, they have multiple sorts of infrastructure they'll be using. They don't have the luxury of just one.
And we have a lot of research that shows that organizations are running multiple clusters, sometimes over 100. In a few cases, we've seen organizations that run over 1,000 of clusters. And they run them in different clouds. They run them for different workloads. Even sometimes the same team is running quite a whole bunch of clusters, and they spin it up within the CI/CD pipeline for external users or for testing, for all kinds of things. And I think those compliance and policy guardrails that you were describing there, I think that is really the key that they found out they need. And I think that's also the essence, a lot of the essence of this research report that I published on Kubernetes distributions. So thank you very much for your input, Michael. This has been quite